I want to welcome Bill Hanstock to the Fight Game Podcast. This is our book club chat. Bill, I usually do interviews one-on-one, but with the book club, it's great. We get to bring in folks who have read the book, and so they'll be asking questions. We have Jason, we have Jeremy, and hopefully we'll get David in here as well. But Bill is the author of the wrestling book, We Promised You a Great Men Event, which covers the history of the WWF, WWE. So I want to welcome you to the podcast, Bill. How's it going?
Thanks very much. I appreciate you having me. It's nice to be here.
Okay, so before we get into the book, I looked you up a little bit. Let everybody know about your pre-author credentials. You've been working for a bunch of websites. You've done stuff outside of websites. Let people know what you've been doing for your career.
Sure. I started my sports writing full-time journalism career in 2011. Started with SB Nation as a news desk writer for what at the time they were doing an experiment with regional sites. And then I moved to sbnation.com and wrote for a couple other random sites. I was actually a founder, one of the founding people of Cage Side Seats way back in the day before Sean and Gino took over, back when Bix was involved, way back in the day when it first launched. It was called Ring Psychology when a group of us formed it, and then it got picked up by SB Nation, became Cage Side Seats. But I stopped writing for them pretty soon after it launched, and then eventually came back to SB Nation when I got hired as a news desk writer. I actually was the person who sort of strong-armed SBNation.com into covering pro wrestling events. They were really hesitant to put pro wrestling stuff on the main site, and I did an experiment with WrestleMania 28 maybe, and it did great, and they agreed to let me do monthly pro wrestling previews and recaps for pay-per-views on WWE on SBNation.com. And then I started running all our pro wrestling coverage on SB Nation. And then I moved to Cage Side Seats and worked with Gino and Sean, helping run Cage Side Seats for a little while. Then I took a job elsewhere and eventually went to Fox Sports, worked for Fox Sports for a couple years in the digital team, won an Emmy, and then got a job opportunity to come back to SB Nation as community manager. So currently I'm working as a community manager throughout the network, primarily on the California sites. But somewhere in there, around the time I was working for Fox Sports, I got the opportunity to write this book, so I took it.
Awesome. So Jason is got to check out a little bit early, so I'll let Jason get to his question in a second. But I wanted to kind of open up with one main question, which is the thing that I thought about immediately when I saw that you'd written this book, which is like, this is a giant project. Like, the history of the entire company is a really giant project. And was that something that you wanted to do? Was this presented to you? Like, and then when you thought about writing this thing, like, how were you nervous about writing it? Like just your thought process on a project like so big, and you understand better than anybody the internet reaction to it all.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. When I was presented the opportunity to pitch a book, the opportunity that was presented to me was a history of WWE, and I realized that's huge. That's a really big thing to undertake, and there isn't really a book that deals with the history of WWE from Jess McMahon to present day. The closest we really have is something like Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, which really focuses on Vince Jr.'s run in WWE, and it also is at this point like 16 or 17 years old.
Yeah.
So there isn't an up-to-date comprehensive history of all of WWE. So I thought that was an exciting prospect for me to do, like for me to be the guy who undertakes that. And like I talked to some other journalists and some other people around the time that I started writing the book, and I said, it's a history of WWE, and sort of all of them were like, it's a history of WWE, like all of it. And because that's people who are in the wrestling business like understand how big that is. And my first draft I turned in was, I think, between 600 and 700 pages in Word, and the final product was like 300 pages in Word, and that's like a 400-page book, which is the end product. So my initial thing that I turned in was really different from what the book ended up being, and it's even more different from what I entered into the project with the mindset of what I was going to do, which when I went into the book, I have a bunch of friends inside the business. I have been around this forever. I have connections to so many people. And beyond that, I wanted to talk to every historian I could. My initial intent was, I want to make the most comprehensive history of WWE that is the most objective and factually correct that has ever been put out. And what I quickly learned when I actually went about the process of writing the book is, uh, I I don't have the capability to do that without having started that work like 15 years ago.
Right.
Like, there are historians who've dedicated their whole lives who I think in the acknowledgments of like, I wouldn't have the information to write this book without their work, like spending their lives dedicated to this. I am not a historian, and I'm not going to be led into that historians club because of this book that I wrote. And I'm not going to be led into that historians club because I have a book deal to write this book and I need assistance with it.
Right.
I'm a journalist and I'm a writer, and what the book I ended up writing is different than the book I set out to write, because not only is it just years and years of work if I want to do the most objective, comprehensive thing, but also the period of time at which I was starting to write the book was the worst possible period of time for trying to get anyone to talk to me. Because, as you guys I'm sure know, the problems are multifold with trying to get pro wrestlers to go on the record about something like legitimate, objective, serious, and non-kayfabe, because old timers expect to be paid for their time. I can't pay people for their time as a journalist. I can't pay people to sit down for an interview for this book. So old timers expect to be paid for their time, or they're not interested in talking. For example, Chavo didn't want to talk. He's like, my story's been out there. I've been talking to people about it for 40 years. Like, you can go look up my stuff. Like, and I don't begrudge anyone anything like that. So, like, I knew that when I set out to write this book, I couldn't and did not want to talk to anyone who was under WWE contract. So that eliminated a huge swath of people. I usually couldn't talk to people who are under Legends contracts because they didn't want to jeopardize anything with that Legends contract. I couldn't talk to anyone who had been released by WWE because most of those people, there are a few people in particular, they absolutely wanted to have nothing regarding their name associated in any way with WWE at that point in time. I couldn't talk to anyone in AEW about the book because they were just getting AEW launched and they didn't want to be invested in putting their time into a book that wasn't about the endeavor that they were putting forward. So it was just the worst possible time for me to want to try and get people to go on the record about the book. But like, I legitimately reached out to hundreds of people to try and get interviews for the book, and I didn't get very many, but the few I got were very invaluable. So if I had been able to get people to go on the record, I would have had a lot more direct quotes in the book. But as such, the thing that I ultimately landed on having the book focused on, which I talk about in the intro chapter, is I wanted to have a book that doesn't talk down to pro wrestling fans. I wanted to have a book that was totally entertaining the whole time. And I wanted to have a book that was equally as entertaining to people who had never seen a pro wrestling match as to people like you and I who've been watching pro wrestling our whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, as you can imagine, a really, really tough needle to thread. And I think I did it to the best of my ability. I've had people tell me I did, but I'm interested to hear what you guys thought of it. But that was my ultimate mindset after I ditched the notion of like, I'm going to have this be the most accurate, most comprehensive WWE book ever. I set about just saying like, you know what, I'm going to have a full history that hits all the stuff I need to hit, gives people some information they may not know about previously, but most of all is entertaining, engaging, and isn't in the business of trying to insult the audience.
Cool. All right, Jason, I know you got to get going today, so I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask the couple questions that you had. I think Jason may have possibly frozen.
And Bill, thanks again for joining us. This is going to be a conversation for everybody. Yeah, sorry. There we go. Okay. Hey, and all right. Thanks again, Garrett, and thanks, Bill, for joining us. The first question I had kind of leads into what you're just talking about. Who did you, when you eventually pared down, understanding that you weren't going to be able to write, the basically the history of the WWF, WWE, who did you think, who was your target audience for it? Who were you saying, hey, this is the audience that I really want to read it, and then if this other audience reads it, that's great as well. Who were you really writing towards with your mind?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I mean, I think that subconsciously, ultimately, I was probably in the broadest terms writing to people like us who have been around it for so long. But that being said, people who I think that I wanted to tap in a lot to the nostalgia aspect of it. There is that bubble of 10 to 15 to 20 million people who watched wrestling who do not watch wrestling now. That well of people that AEW and the internet assumed were just there waiting to be tapped, waiting for there to be an alternative, and then they'd all come flooding back. Like, that assumption has proven to be incorrect. But I know for a fact that there are a ton of people out there who don't watch wrestling but love wrestling and buy old stuff. There are several historians who don't write about anything and don't research anything like after 1960, and they have huge audiences of people who are strictly like old time pro wrestling fans. So I know that there's a big old world out there, and I also know that there's a world of moms and dads and grandpas who will see a book about pro wrestling with an Attitude Era cover or whatever, and they'll pick it up for someone in their life who used to like wrestling or who still likes wrestling or whatever. So I was sort of trying to split the uprights between people like us, people who have huge nostalgia for WWE, because I've talked to a lot of people who haven't watched wrestling in 20 years and they read the book and they're just like, oh, all these memories, this is great. But I also know, from being around covering pro wrestling for the past 11 years, I also know that there's a shit ton of fans. Sorry, can I cuss on here?
Yes, you totally can.
There's a shit ton of fans out there who aren't terminally online and are adult fans that just love pro wrestling, and they don't really care about the why isn't Cesaro getting a push of everything. They don't really care. They like what's presented to them, and they are the true WWE fan that watches all the shows every week, doesn't get online to see what the backstage dirt is, doesn't read the news, the trades. They're just pro wrestling fans. I know that there's a ton of those people out there, and a lot of those people are people from marginalized groups who aren't straight white cis dudes that do love the product. And I wanted to speak to them as well, in a sense of this is a book about a thing you love, and it's not exclusionary, it's not gatekeepy, it's a book of the facts as best I can get to them, and it's entertaining for you. It'll be a fun, quick read for you. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, just like it's tricky to split the uprights of what the book I was attempting to write. It's also tricky to split the uprights of the exact audience you want to try and get.
Yeah. And I definitely agree. I thought it was it was a quick, entertaining read, but it also covered a lot of the main points. So I definitely appreciated it. One thing that I did think that was missing, and you definitely touched on it, there wasn't a lot of Randy Savage in it. And I thought that was the one thing that I thought was kind of a miss, just because he was, you get into the theme of finding the next Hulk Hogan, and Randy Savage was kind of the bridge when in after WrestleMania 4, and was the bridge after WrestleMania 8 as well. He was kind of the next person, and then eventually, obviously, he was sidelined himself before going to WCW. I guess my question would be more, what was the process working with your editor like in terms of looking at was there anything that you thought really needed to be in there, but you're convinced otherwise?
Sure. Yeah. So I love my editor to death. Her name's Hannah Long. She's with Harper, and I think that she made the book so much better. I think that the end product that you ended up certainly with, the quick fun read, and I appreciate you saying that, and it means a lot. That's due to her and her like helping me craft the book, because this is the first book I've been writing since 2000 or earlier, but this is the first book I've written. So I didn't know exactly how to do it. I just did it the way I felt it should be done, and then she helped me shape it after that initial draft. So it was actually, I felt it was really good for her to be the one editing the book, that she had some knowledge of pro wrestling, but she wasn't a fan of pro wrestling. And I think that really helped as far as just helping me speak to a wider audience, but also like I could, it was a give and take of like, there wasn't really many instances of it, but if there was something that she had gone and said, like, I think you should pull this out, like I could have told her, like, people will expect me to talk about this in a history of WWE. Like, I'm sure that you noticed many spots in the book where like I didn't talk about a thing, but it wasn't necessarily important to the whole history of WWE that I do talk about that thing. So there was a lot of stuff, like I actually wrote the entire story of Tom Mega Man McGee in the first draft, and she was like nice. Like, it's an entertaining story, especially to us, but she was smart enough to be like, you spend so many pages on Tom McGee and it doesn't go anywhere, and he is a blip in the ultimate story of all of this. So as it is in the book, I think I have a couple sentences about him now, but it's stuff like that where it's how, since we're telling the story of the whole company, you have to take a macro approach to it. You have to zoom out and take the 20,000 foot view of it and say, okay, in the story of pro wrestling, what do you need to tell? And I agree, there could have been more Randy Savage in there. I think part of the reason that there isn't more Randy Savage in there is because if you dive too deep into Randy Savage, you have to dive also into who Randy Savage was as a person. And the central stories of who Randy Savage was as a person are so varied and disputed that it's such a tangled can of worms to try and unpack that. Like what really happened with Elizabeth, what really happened with the rumors of why he left the company, like all of that stuff. So since I can't answer any of that, and there's no way for me to, especially with people not being willing to talk to me, if there's no way for me to really parse what's happening there, like ultimately, yeah, Savage was a huge component of what made the bridge from WrestleMania 3 to WrestleMania 5 work. But ultimately, Randy was on top for 1 year. And even in that year, Hulk was still around. So he wasn't really the one person carrying the company. Like that's how I am forced to look at things. Like as a performer, I think Randy Savage is one of the greatest and one of the most underrated people in the history of pro wrestling. And yeah, I probably did him a little bit of a disservice in as far as like his import to the business and what he meant. But a lot of his import to the business also came outside of WWF, like the Slim Jim commercials, his WCW run, like who Randy Savage, like Bonesaw, like who Randy Savage is as a person, at like, Space Ghost dad, like who Randy Savage means to pop culture at large isn't necessarily like his few years in WWE and his 1 year on top there, if that makes sense. Like the one thing I was really struck by when I was writing the book, honestly, is how little Undertaker matters to the history of WWE. Like, I could have written this book without mentioning the Undertaker, basically. Like, his WrestleMania streak was huge, and it's important. It was important to a lot of people, but it wasn't even a thing until like his 11th or 12th win at WrestleMania, when they were like, "Oh, hey, he hasn't lost," and then they retroactively made it into a big deal. But like, Undertaker never carried the company. Sure, he's iconic. He's beloved by two generations of fans at this point, but ultimately, he isn't that big a figure. There's so many huge stars in pro wrestling, but so few of them ultimately matter to the history of it, which is crazy to say. Like, it's the same thing with baseball stars. Like, I feel like you could tell the story of, I mean, maybe if he gets to 700, maybe not, but like, you can kind of tell the story of baseball without mentioning Albert Pujols, which is crazy to say, but it's like, you know, 3-time MVP, and now he's passed Willie Mays on the all-time home run list. But like, nothing about Albert Pujols like changed anything in baseball. He was just there. Like, there's so many MVPs that I never knew anything about. So many dudes won like 2 MVP awards, and I'm like, I've never heard of this guy. You know?
Yeah. All right, Jason, do you have anything else?
Just one general question. When the Netflix documentary drops about Vince McMahon, are you going to be able to watch it and enjoy it, or are you going to be sitting there saying, you know what? I know that's not right.
Well, I mean, I'm able to watch WWE and their version of events without. I mean, there's like I think the Chris Hemsworth movie is about Hulk Hogan is going to be probably harder for me to watch. It's just it's tough. Like, I mean, Hogan hosting this year's WrestleMania is tough. Like, there's, you know, at this point, part of being a pro wrestling fan is having to swallow some shit, and that's always been the case. Like, if this is a thing you love, if this is a thing you enjoy, you have to sift out the stuff that is offensive to you in order to enjoy it. Just like Peacock Network is doing it right now.
Yeah.
Hey, Jason, thanks for taking time out of your day. I know you got a lot of stuff to do, but I'm glad that you were actually able to join the beginning of this.
No, I was happy to join. As I said, I did enjoy the book a lot, and it was great to be able to ask a few questions, Bill, and looking forward to hearing the rest as well.
I really appreciate it, man. I hope you have a great day.
All right. Thanks, you too.
All right, Jeremy, I know you wanted to jump in and ask your first question here.
Hey, Bill, I'm Jeremy. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Thank you. I was going to go back to the Undertaker thing. I realized when I was reading the book that the main time you really spent time with him were the profiles that you wrote. Mm-hmm. And I thought they were a good tone for the entire book because they were thoughtful, they were funny, and they were irreverent, but they weren't mean. They were critical. They were critical of the performer's work or the company's gimmick they had for him. But was that intentional for the whole book, for you to have that kind of tone of critical but not mean and informative? And was that a conscientious approach on your part?
Yeah, it was definitely a conscientious approach on my part. I try not to punch down, and I know that with like the McMahons, it would be punching up if I were mean to them. But while I was entertaining, I was also still attempting to be a journalist throughout. And I don't think that there's ever any benefit, especially within the world of journalism. I don't think there's ever really any benefit to being mean or cruel. That's the mindset of a strain of media and journalism that I have no interest in taking part in. And I think that if you're really trying to be objective and you're really trying to be sympathetic and empathetic to the people that you're writing about, like, it's up to the reader to draw conclusions about how they should feel about things. It's not up to me. Like, I can make jokes and I can say like this situation was pretty fucked up if you look at it objectively, like Saba Simba or stuff like that. Like, this is pretty fucked up. But I feel like in the instance of this company and in the instance of the family that runs this company, I think that being objective and laying out facts is the most effective way you can critique something. Because, that old adage of, like, you've never been in this business, you've never taken a bump, like, what do you know? Well, I know the public record, and I know facts, and I know things that are documented by people who don't work for this company. And I think that by presenting those facts and by presenting the side of the people who have gone on the record and the side of the people who appear to have been legitimately wronged, I don't need to be cruel. I think that the record sort of speaks for itself.
It really does. When you were writing those profiles, how much of it was from memory? How much of it was research? And how much time did you spend going through that? And actually, how much time did you spend going through the network as a whole for research for the entire book?
Yeah, the research process was a ton of hours and a ton of time. There was some stuff that I tried as best I could. I know that there's a couple hours that slipped through in the final offing, but compared to like the normal sort of book of this scope, I think I did pretty good.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But like I got a couple dates wrong and stuff like that in the final printed version, but I can live with it. The process, I went back and read through so many observers. I went back and watched so much stuff. I went through so many Wikipedia pages, and when I went through Wikipedia pages, then I actually cross-referenced stuff that I saw on Wikipedia that I thought might be a little bit dubious. So I tried to, again, be as accurate as I could. I also read a bunch of books. I read Sex, Lies, and Headlocks. I read Barnums of Bounce. I read Chokehold. I read, pretty much every history that you can get out there. I read Wrestling at the Garden. I read the Capitol, like all the Mooneyham books, and I read 3 dozen books and watched countless hours of the network. But I'm sort of a guy who had been watching a bunch of network anyway, and I had been reporting on pro wrestling for the past however many years. So it wasn't a situation where I had been away from this bubble for so long that I needed to like do a bunch of there's stuff that I started writing about where it's like, I just watched that a couple months ago, like unrelated to this book. So yeah, it was a ton of watching network stuff. It was a ton of reading through old stuff. Mad props to Dave Meltzer and the Observer for like having available to us contemporaneous like notes of what was happening at the time, because like, there was a whole legal vetting process for this book, as you can imagine. And like, where the legal team was like, where'd you get this fact? Where'd you get this fact? I'm like, contemporaneous reporting, man. It's out there. So thank God for that.
All right. So I've heard 2 criticisms of the book, which are completely at opposite sides of the spectrum, which made me wonder how, if you heard this, which is, A, you were far too easy on Vince, and B, you were far too hard on Vince. And to me, I thought you were pretty dead set in the middle on Vince. And so I just wondered if you were getting feedback based on people's perspective of what they think about Vince, and if you heard sort of the same swath back and forth of if you treated him harshly or if you were too easy on him.
Yeah, I've heard both things as well. And it's funny because around 2013, 14, somewhere in there, I got accused of being on WWE payroll because I was too nice to WWE and to the decisions that they would make, and in my reviews of pay-per-views and stuff. So I've been accused of being in WWE's pocket for a long time. And I think that I honestly think that one of the reasons that I'm I'm not. I think one of the reasons I'm not more well known in the world of pro wrestling is because I do tend to call things exactly down the middle and be pragmatic and objective. And I don't think that that's really what people want in a pro wrestling journalist,
especially on Twitter, right?
Especially on Twitter.
You got to pick a side. You got to like go hard on one side. Like it's crazy.
Yeah.
You got to wear the crest.
Yeah. So I've been hearing that. Both sides argument. As long as I've been writing about pro wrestling. So hearing that about the book means that I'm staying true to who I am as a journalist and as a writer, because it's the same thing I've been hearing since I started writing about pro wrestling, is that I'm both too hard and too easy on Vince. So, I mean, I think that, given the huge breadth of who pro wrestling fans are, I think that means that I'm doing the correct thing. Or the thing that
it reminded me of is you'll hear national broadcasters who do, for instance, football games or baseball games or basketball games, and they'll say that they get heat from both sides, where the fan bases say, "Why do you hate our team?" in the same game.
Yeah. No, if you any game, especially postseason baseball, any game that Joe Buck is calling, like search Joe Buck and one team and Joe Buck and the other team, and people will be like, Joe Buck hates our team. Like the only thing I'm convinced of is that Joe Buck is a Cardinals fan. Like he roots for the Cardinals. That's the one thing I'm convinced of. But
me too.
You can search any national broadcaster, search their name and both teams, and you're gonna be like, man, this guy is up our ass. This guy hates our team, like on both sides. So I think that's if that's the standard I have, if that's the cross I have to bear for like trying to call things down the middle as best I can, I'm happy to bear it.
All right, Jeremy, I know you had another one.
Yeah, Bill, you mentioned having to manage how you felt about stuff, a lot like compartmentalization of your feelings when it comes to a wrestling promotion and the wrestlers and what they do in their real life and how they perform, and feelings about Benoit and Owen Hart, Eddie Guerrero. Sometimes people even lose their mind about CM Punk leaving the company, which is nothing like any of that. But people treat it with that same level of life-ending consequences on Twitter. How have you managed with compartmentalizing your feelings on wrestling when things like that affect you? And what were the things that most affected you as a wrestling fan over the years?
Those are both really great questions. I do honestly think that having a true journalism background and like actually working as a journalist like prior to doing journalism within pro wrestling is sort of a fundamental thing to really separate, like, here is how I feel about a thing and here's the truth that I need to report on or that I need to cover or write about, because those are two very different things. And like I have a ton of respect for people who are in like publicly funded like media or whatever that have to write about politics or have to write about whatever like shit that like really matters in the world, and they have to cover it just based on like here's what's happening and not get like completely pissed off and flip out about it. And I think that honestly, like writing this book in the age of Trump sort of helps with the compartmentalization, because like, and I wrote, like the COVID era is in the book. Like I was writing the book, I was writing portions of the book during the pandemic. So like having like an omnipresent, like existentialist, like, holy fuck, the world is insane over me. And I also had a kid while I was writing this book. So like having everything in the world happening around me while I was writing about pro wrestling, that's a really great way to center yourself and ground yourself of like, okay, it's pro wrestling and let's focus on the facts and let's just talk about it and have fun with it where it's appropriate to have fun with it. Like don't joke about like during Rita Chatterton stuff, like just tell the story, and where there's levity, where there's space for levity, where you can breathe, like have the levity in there, have the entertainment factor in there. But yeah, I think that just having shit happen around you is a good way to like really be like, I can enjoy this for what is being presented to me, and I can think about what I'm watching right now, and then I'll focus on who is doing the entertaining after I'm done with that.
Yeah, I empathize with that completely. I definitely feel that wrestling, even though it wasn't what we were all used to over the last year, the escape that it presented for us was something that I'm going to be pretty thankful for. And also thankful that for the most part, we could go into the WWE COVID protocols, but for the most part, it's been safer than a disaster for the performers in this
I feel I honestly feel that WWE's been probably more conscientious of their performers than AEW has been during this situation, and maybe I'm incorrect in that. That's my personal feeling on it. But I also, as far as from a performer standpoint, from a pro wrestler standpoint, like I am endlessly thankful to that both WWE and AEW have all these performers under contract right now, and Impact as well. I'm so grateful that these people are paying people. Like, even though, yeah, the epitome of fucked up what WWE did, where they released all those people right after announcing record profits. Most of those people landed on their feet elsewhere, signed other contracts. So, like, good, that's good. But like, I'm grateful that you have 3 companies and ROH 4 companies paying people right now, because that is so much better than all these hundreds and thousands of performers on the indie circuit who are having to either decide between, am I not going to earn income for a year, or am I going to have to disastrously risk horribly unsafe conditions to do ill-advised indie shows all over the country and string together a living? Because there are indie promotions that I really respect that have been extremely irresponsible during the pandemic. And I think that the most dangerous part of WrestleMania weekend right now, honestly, is not having WrestleMania with 25,000 fans, because honestly, Super Bowl already broke that seal with way fewer restrictions in place, and that sucked. And they were basically like, the NFL is basically okay with being like, come to Tampa, have a week-long party. It's cool. Like, I think the worst part about WrestleMania weekend right now is like, there's going to be 50 to 75 indie events that week. And that sucks, dude. Like, I understand that like the WrestleMania machine that has been built up at this point is like, all these indie promotions are like, we're going to make our whole year's revenue this week and we need it. Like, I get that. But like, if there was ever a year to pare down and work with other promotions and be like, let's do 6 super shows, or like, let's do like whatever, like, this is the year to do it. Or to like, if there's ever been a year to be like, this sucks, but we got to not do this year, this is the year to do it. But instead, we're getting like the better part of 100 indie events that week, and I haven't heard of any protocols on those.
You got a Lollapalooza festival of wrestling going on in Florida over WrestleMania weekend. It could be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm not going. I'm probably not going to go to another pro wrestling event until the Los Angeles WrestleMania. If that, I'm not comfortable with it. You know, I've been around pro wrestling long enough to know I don't trust a fellow pro wrestling fan to care about my life. As bad as that sucks to say. Like, I might trust you guys, but
you're all good,
we've been there. We've definitely been there.
I'm sorry. So you were asking, the other part of your question was, what are the most
compartmentalization and what personal moments you had as a wrestling fan, not as a journalist, that you just kind of had to take a step back and like, okay, this is happening. This is way not cool. How do I feel about watching this now?
Owen was probably the first one. Because I honestly, I didn't have a computer until 97, 98. So I wasn't like, even though I had heard stuff about how the business worked, I mean, like Beyond the Mat was probably my first like, oh, here's how it. Like I had seen like I watched like Secrets of Wrestling Exposed and stuff, so I knew about stuff. I read Mick Foley's books and all that, but like I wasn't a true smart mark in the sense of smart markdom until like well into my adulthood. So um, so Owen was the first big one for me of like, how could they possibly, keep doing this, and how do I feel about a company that allowed this to happen? But still, at the time, I was so immature that my big gripe at that time when Owen died was like, Owen died, and he died like basically the same month as JFK Jr. And like JFK Jr. was like on the cover of every magazine, at the front of like every news show for months and months. And I was like, Owen Hart spent 20 years of his life going out, harming himself every night to make thousands of people happy. Like, I don't know what JFK Jr. ever did other than run a magazine and be the son of a president. So like, why is there this love? And I also wasn't old enough to know about the kid saluting his dad's casket. I wasn't old enough to know that like he was the representation of like the lost innocence of America, and now he's dead. So like, I didn't understand, like I had no connection to JFK Jr. He's just a rich guy. So like, I didn't understand from my viewpoint of like, you should be covering Owen. You should be talking about this dude who literally gave his life to try and entertain people, as opposed to a dude who took out a private jet and crashed it because he wasn't a very good pilot. Like, that was my thought at the time. So like that, yeah, Owen caused me to pull back and evaluate like the scumminess of pro wrestling. But it came at the same time that I was like, no, we should celebrate this guy because he did provide so much entertainment to so many for so long. That was the first one. There was stuff, like going to like in the early 2000s, going to like the DVD VR message boards and looking at like the scummy pro wrestling, like tell me your worst pro wrestling stories and all that stuff. And then like learning about Snuka. But then the next major one was Benoit, of course, because me and all my friends, like he was our favorite pro wrestler. Like one of my best friends, he doesn't really care about wrestling very much, but Chris Benoit was his favorite dude. And like, that was when we learned about it. Like, my first assumption was like, it was like Weird Al's parents. Like, there was a carbon monoxide leak and like everyone in the house died. And I think that a lot of people also operated under that assumption for the first day. And we watched the tribute Raw. And then the next day it all came out, and my friend, who didn't care about pro wrestling, but he cared a lot about Chris Benoit, he was like, man, this sucks, man, because I really loved Chris Benoit. He was a person who allowed me to connect with pro wrestling in a way that no one else has ever done. But now he's just another statistic. Like, he's just another angry white dude who is an abuser and killed his family. And like, that's always stuck with me, of like, the shittiness of white dudes and the abuse of men to women and children. And that was obviously a horrible one. I dipped for a lot of the ruthless aggression era. But that was big. And then that was probably the last big one. And then, Punk leaving. I feel like in the network era, in the last like 15 years or so, it's been sort of just a steady stream of like every once in a while, like something awful will come to light. And it happens so much that it's just like, if I stuck with it through Owen, if I stuck with it through Benoit, if I stuck with it through ECW and WCW going under, if I stuck with it through whatever and whatever and whatever, and I'm still watching it sometimes, like, that's on me. Like it, I probably don't have a dividing line. If Benoit didn't cause me to, if the Saudi deal didn't cause me to, I mean, admittedly, part of that is like I cover pro wrestling for a living, or I did up until last year. You know, I cover pro wrestling for a living. I write books about pro wrestling. So like it's sort of my job to keep watching it, but I do enjoy it. Like NXT is my favorite thing about pro wrestling. I genuinely believe that like since 2010 or so, like we live in the best possible time to be pro wrestling fans because anything that we could possibly want to watch in pro wrestling is at our fingertips at an instant. Anything, any type of wrestling that we want to watch, there's an entire promotion or more dedicated to that all the time. Like it's so easy to find what you want to watch that if you're still complaining about what WWE is putting on, you're doing it on purpose. Like you're playing yourself. You know, like if you're still upset about what WWE is doing, I understand they're like a shitty company on a certain level, but like they also employ a lot of your favorite people and provide them with good livings. And I'm sure that there are people in the company who are artistically unfulfilled or creatively unfulfilled, but every person that's still employed in that company has made a contract versus like, do I like making a good living out my absolute dream, or would I prefer to make a slightly worse living out my dream with the possibility of complete artistic fulfillment? So like especially now with AEW and ROH and Impact and New Japan and all these people who can pay full-time contracts to people, like it's the best possible time to be a pro wrestler right now. And I'm happy for them. And just, yeah, like if you like pro wrestling and you're upset about not getting the type of pro wrestling you want, you should try Googling better, I guess.
All right, so I have this theory about Vince McMahon and why the product is currently as it is today. You know, it's about the brand, it's about TV. He obviously made the right moves for the bottom line of the company and for his pocketbooks. He really, some of it is probably luck, but he's really made key decisions that allowed WWE to basically be such a billion-dollar company that it is. But I have three things that I think kind of took him to that mindset because, as we know, he's a big control freak, and taking the things outside of his control, I feel, are a big part of it. And so I kind of come back to these, and this is like a working list. I haven't really thought about it too in-depthly, but I bring it back to three major things. The first thing is not being able to find another Rock and Austin, and comparing everybody who you try to build into that mindset to Rock and Austin. Like those are just two gigantic talents that we may never ever see again, in our lifetimes in pro wrestling. The second thing I think is the how the product got so violent during that Attitude Era with the chair shots, with these crazy things, the way that folks were willing to put themselves into danger to get over. We look at Foley. Because of concussions, because of drug abuse, Vince had to figure a way how to pull back on that to make the product safer, kind of to save the talent from themselves in a sense. I think that was the second one. And the third one is what we just talked about, which is Benoit, which ultimately was completely outside of Vince McMahon's control. And you can look at it in a couple different ways and say, well, because Vince didn't have protocols in place with steroids or painkiller abuse and things of that nature, that falls under his radar for sure. But it wasn't like Vince wanted Benoit to do all of these different things. He kind of took it from the outside perspective of, well, you got to get that brass ring. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to, do I have to look better for TV? Do I have to wrestle this crazier style? How do I get over? Like, there's really no blueprint, right? It's just been this kind of this black box because your whole fate is in one person's hands. So I looked at those three things, and I'm sure there's a ton more, but I pulled back and thought, okay, those were three things that he cannot control in the creativeness and in the success of his company. and those two of those things actually brought his company down.
Yeah.
How do you eliminate the things that you cannot control? And that's how I see the product today, which is, even if it's not as popular as it was, it is more there is more equity in it today because of the TV contracts, but it's also something that Vince can control, and it's also something that Vince will never be surprised about under this current watch, right? Because he's got such a finger on the pulse of everything because of what they are not allowed to do, really. But you just researched, and I'm sure you read so much about Vince. Like, what is your mindset about the reason why the product is where it is today versus where it was during the different peaks when we were watching it growing up?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think as to the third point, the third point was about Benoit, or the second point?
This third
point. I think the combination of Guerrero and Benoit, more than just Benoit, because for Vince, Guerrero was, although small for Vince's taste, Guerrero truly had it all for Vince, like the charisma, the personality, the work on the microphone, that he was a Latino star, like there's just like everything, the body, the ability in the ring, but also like the personality and the merchandise sales and just catchphrases and connecting with the crowd and all that. The fact that Vince trusted him to get to the top, that they had to take it away with him because of his personal demons, that he battled back and got those demons under control and was on the cusp of being given a chance to really run with the company, and it all going away, combined with Benoit, because in Vince's mind, it's like, here's a guy I know I can trust who got everything in order and now he's gone. And here's a guy who I don't necessarily trust, but everyone really wants me to trust him. And he went off the deep end and now he's gone. Like, you have the two halves of that in Vince's mind, of like, here's what a new generation of pro wrestling looks like, that you necessarily wouldn't choose for yourself. Like, because you would choose the big guys and the superheroes. But here's two guys. Here's one that you trust, and here's one that people want you to trust. And now they're both gone. I think that meant a lot. And right on the heels of those, the company being like, Kurt Angle, we love you to death. You've got everything we want. We know that you have what it takes to carry our company. We cannot let you continue to kill yourself. And him being like, then I'll leave and go wrestle somewhere else. That was, like, to me, the first like public example of like WWE trying to do the right thing in spite of someone's own belief in like what they should do.
Yeah,
and
right. It was almost like Vince, it was almost like Vince was catering to the outside, rather than trusting his own instincts, because of some of it's because his own instincts were also not working at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think that what you're saying is completely correct. I read about this a lot towards the end of the book, about how WWE shifted from putting their eggs in the basket of like stars will carry the company to putting their eggs in the basket of the brand is the most important thing. And he learned that by watching America and what's successful about America. Like, millions of people watch the Oscars every year. Is it because they've seen all the movies, or is it because they know that the Oscars are important? The NFL is the most important thing in America. Is it because of a specific team? No. They're going to watch football. It's because fantasy football, and people gamble on it, and people are addicted to the idea of football. So I think that he watched this for so long in conjunction with like, I'm never going to reach Hogan, I'm never going to reach Rock, I'm never going to reach Austin, to being like, what if people came to see pro wrestling and not to see a pro wrestler? Or what if they came to see my company?
Sports entertainment.
Instead of coming to, because I mean, I think around the time of WrestleMania 24, 25, probably, I think that's where it really turned. And like, going to WrestleMania was a thing. It doesn't matter, for how many, like before Corona, like how many years did WrestleMania tickets just sell out when they were put on sale? Like months before anyone knew any match that was going to be on the card.
Yep.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So like, and I tell everyone, like, who's not a wrestling fan, I'm like, everyone should experience going to WrestleMania once.
Yeah.
Because you should. It's fucking incredible.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing like that experience anywhere. There's fucking explosions and like spectacle and celebrities, and maybe a little person will get a trash can thrown at him. Like, what? Like, you can't beat it. You just can't beat it. And it does, and it's never gonna matter. Like, with the exception of like 27, which was like a fluke. Like, it's never really gonna matter. It's gonna be fun. Yeah, like, it's probably gonna be too long, but it's going to be fun. You're going to have fun for at least a little while. And when you want to leave, you can leave. It doesn't matter, especially if you don't care what matches are on the show. Like, you go to see WrestleMania. And I think that, people who talk about the sameness of Raw, the sameness of the weekly shows, like, I think that Vince is just taking a page from like Stan Lee, like the whole, like, everyone's comic book is someone's first comic book. Like, every comic book that's ever printed, someone who picks that comic book up is going to be the very first comic book they ever read. And that's why, like,
shooter method.
Yeah, exactly. So people who go to Raw don't go because they're like, oh, I heard Kane's going to wrestle Mr. Kennedy or whatever. Like, they don't go because of that. They go because they want to see Raw. They want to go to Raw. They want to hear the music. They want to see whoever's going to come out on Raw, and they want to be part of that experience that they see on television. That's why every Raw looks the same. And that's why every SmackDown looks the same, is because you don't want there to be a hard divide between what people see on TV every week. And then when they go to the arena, it has to be the same experience. And you don't get that without focusing everything you have on the brand instead of the people who are going to come out and talk to the people every week.
All right. I told you I wanted to get you out of here within an hour. So this is the last question. And it's kind of a two-parter. So I hope you don't feel like you have to give a super long answer, but you mentioned your macro level of approach of writing the book. Was there one specific topic that you covered where you were like, if I ever write another book, I could just really unravel the yarn on this topic and it would make a great book? And then secondly, which is related, the whole process of this, I imagine it was such a long process for you. And do you have any thoughts of doing something else, doing another book? Or did that process just kind of, make you kind of kill you and just say, maybe I'll do this again, in 10 years or something?
No, I very much, I'll probably go backwards on this one. I very much want to write another book. I already have plans about the next book I want to write. Honestly, hopefully I won't write another book about pro wrestling, but if I do, I won't begrudge it because I'll have a good reason for doing it. It'll probably mean I'm getting paid for it. So I have a lot of books that I want to write. A couple of nonfiction. There's a novel series that I'm trying to write, but I am a writer. Like I said, I've been writing screenplays since 2000. I've written like 20 something feature screenplays. So the book was something that I wasn't like, I've written so many millions of words already in being in sports writing since 2011 and screenwriting for 10 years before that. But the book was something different that I never experienced before. And it was really interesting. And the book, I'm really proud of what ended up being the book. I'm really proud of my collaboration with Harper and Hannah, my editor. It means a lot to me because I've always wondered if I could write a book. Now I know I can, and that seal's broken. So like, there's more books I want to write. I'd like to write. There's a book about comic books I want to write. There's a book about sort of television history that I want to write. And like I said, there's a novel series and there's a couple other things. So yeah, I hope to write more books. I hope to do more of this. As far as in the world of pro wrestling, it's not my intent to write more books about pro wrestling, but I think that there is a lot of stuff there that I could write. I would be open to, if there were someone who wanted me to co-write their autobiography with them, I would definitely be open to that sort of thing. But like there's a lot of stuff in there that I could definitely do deeper dives into. I would honestly, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, whatever, I would be open to wanting to investigate the AEW story, because there's so much there. I was just joking about it last night about the most ill-advised thing I think maybe in recent pro wrestling history is Ring of Honor agreeing to produce All In and use all of their infrastructure, and then AEW just being like, all right, see you down the road. Because there's that whole thing, the Cody bet and the story of All In and the story of the MSG, ROH, and JPW sellout, which is definitely a part of the AEW story, even though they weren't there. And AEW launching and the completely astronomical expectations for what AEW was going to be. And I love AEW. I have a lot of love for AEW, and I have infinite love for the performers there. Like the fact that like Bryce Rensburg, Rick Knox, Peter Avalon, like these people that I've known, like are getting the stage and getting full-time contracts. The fact that fucking Excalibur is calling one of the two biggest weekly television shows is like the best thing that could have ever happened. Like, so I sort of like, the MCU, like watching Avengers Endgame and like seeing Captain America pick up the hammer and then like hearing him say Avengers Assemble is sort of like, I've literally waited my whole life for this to happen, and it's happening at the end of like a 22 movie single story that sort of feels like it's just for me. Like it's sort of like I cannot believe I lived long enough to see this happen, and that it's real and it means something to me. Like that's sort of how I feel about the whole like Excalibur getting a chance to do it. Like hopefully it'll be an Excalibur 2-man booth at some point, because I think that would be for the best for everyone involved. But like there's like a ton of love I have for AEW, but like again, like going back to the whole like me like always having to like try and look at things from all angles is like, I'm really curious to see how long the goodwill lasts from a fan standpoint. Like the exploding ring, I think, was a big test for people because it was a huge botch, and I believe that pretty much everyone involved there handled it the worst way they could have handled it immediately after the fact. So like there's just so much stuff that I see all the time where I'm like, man, if this happened to the other company, you'd fucking rip their ass apart. Like this just like, so I'm curious to see how long the true goodwill lasts of like the whatever, it's not WWE, so I like it.
Well, I mean, we'll see in the next pay-per-view number, because the TV ratings, they've been pretty consistent. Yeah. But I think, when it comes to spending that $50, that was their best, their highest buy pay-per-view ever. And some of it is because of that. I would assume a lot of it is because of that exploding match. And if you didn't give them what they paid for, and then you have another pay-per-view coming in May, well, I mean, there's got to be, if what you're saying, how we measure this, if that number goes down, then there were a lot of people disappointed in that, and that could be, sure, the first maybe barometer of what you're talking about. But yeah, anyways,
sure. I don't expect I personally don't expect it'll be that big of a hit, because I think that their fan base is passionate and dedicated right now, and that's good.
Yeah,
and that's exactly what we need for a viable alternative.
And that's why they created the company, right? Because they saw this avenue of fans who were desperate and passionate and just not into WWE anymore. And like, that's a market thing, and they saw the market. So all good for them. And now they have to perform and they have to, build the company and the creative and everything. They have the same pressures that WWE's had for the last 20 years, so anyways,
I think the inverse thing is also very funny with like the AEW diehards who are now watching more WWE than they used to, because they're like, oh, I wonder what crap WWE is going to put out this week to try and
the hate watching thing
that
doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
Like, even Cornette watches both products. Like it's a rising tide lifts all ships,
Yeah. Anyways, no, thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate this. It was kind of cool to have the little Twitter interaction and then be like, oh, Bill's book, we could see if he come on and do this. Like, that's one of my favorite things to do, is actually talk to the author. We've done it with Brian Alvarez, we've done it with Meltzer, we did it with Keith Greenberg, who had his independent book on the indies that came out. So no, you coming on here was just so tremendous for us, and I really thank you.
I really appreciate it, guys. It was thank you. It was a great conversation. Always love to have them. So hopefully I'll talk to you guys again soon.
All right. So thanks to Jason, who had to leave us a little bit early. Thanks to Jeremy. And of course, thanks to Bill. I am Double G. We'll see you when we see you. Peace out.